Hello everyone. In this video, we will be looking about a very crucial concept that's related to physiology, pathology, and pharmacology at the same time. The concept is the arachidonic acid pathway. So, arachidonic acid is derived from the cell membrane of our cells in the body. Okay, so this arachidonic acid goes through a series of reactions to produce few biochemical compounds that are really crucial and important role players in various physiologic and pathologic mechanisms, and these mechanisms have a lot of pharmaceutical applications to it. Now let me just start with the basics and make you understand from where does the arachidonic acid is derived. So as you know, we are all made up of cells and tissues, right? And the cell contains a cell membrane, and by now you should know from biochemistry that the cell membrane is made up of phospholipids and proteins, right? So usually under normal physiological conditions, and if in special cases if there is any injury, there is a certain pathway through which this phospholipid is converted into arachidonic acid, and there's an enzyme that does it. We'll be talking about it more later, but I'm just giving you gist now. So this phospholipid is converted into arachidonic acid, and this arachidonic acid goes through a series of reactions, specifically the COX and the LOX pathway, to produce those biochemical compounds, which are your prostanoids and your leukotrienes and lipoxins. Okay, so the COX pathway itself is divided into two more pathways, COX1 and COX2. Now, before I go any further into the specifics of the reaction, I want you to understand a basic concept that's about injury. So, if there is an injury to the cell or a tissue, what happens? There is inflammation, right? And if there is inflammation, you see vasodilation. That means there is more blood flow to that tissue, so that more WBCs, RBCs, platelets can be delivered to that certain site. So there is inflammation, vasodilation, and a lot of WBCs accumulating in the site of injury. And at the same time, in the clinical manifestations, you can see that there is swelling, there is pain that you feel, and there is erythema, there is redness. So these are all the characteristics of an injury. Now let's see how this pathway and the biochemical compounds that are produced through this pathway help in this process, and how certain pharmaceutical agents can be used in between to inhibit this pathway so that we don't feel the pain or the swelling or the clinical manifestations that is given by the injury. Okay. So this is the pathway. So you have your membrane phospholipids. What happens? There is this enzyme called phospholipase A2. This phospholipase A2 converts your membrane phospholipids into arachidonic acid. Okay, and this arachidonic acid enters two pathways, namely your COX and LOX. Through COX, it produces different kinds of prostaglandins, and through LOX, which is your lipoxygenase pathway, COX is your cyclooxygenase pathway, and LOX is your lipoxygenase pathway. Through lipoxygenase pathway, it produces a lot of leukotrienes. Okay, all these prostaglandins and leukotrienes have functions that impact the injury or the pathology that goes behind the injury process that I told you before. Okay, now as I told, do you remember COX has two subdivisions, COX1 and COX2? What's the difference between COX1 and COX2? To understand the difference, COX1 means some homeostatic process. What is homeostasis? That means the balance, the equilibrium that our body has, right, to maintain a stable, healthy environment. So COX1 is active under normal physiologic conditions. So that's why COX1 is homeostatic. But COX2 is a pro-inflammatory enzyme. So COX2 gets only activated when there is a specific cell injury or something like that that requires certain chemical factors to go there and act. So COX1 is always active. COX2 is active only during injury conditions or inflammatory conditions, and that's why it is pro-inflammatory. Okay. So as a result, you produce a lot of prostaglandins. These are the prostaglandins. You can just take a look at them. I'll be explaining specific functions of these prostaglandins in the next slide. So yeah. So as I said, prostaglandins mainly help with inflammation, the process of inflammation. Now let's say there's an injury and COX2 pathway gets activated. The arachidonic acid comes down from the cell membrane, from the phospholipid, and the COX2 pathway gets activated and it produces the prostaglandins. Now specifically, prostaglandin E2 helps with vasodilation. It goes and attaches to specific receptors in your blood vessels, and it causes the blood to vasodilate, so more blood can flow. And at the same time, it increases the permeability of the blood vessels, so WBCs and macrophages can escape from the tissues and go to the blood vessels and travel to different sites. Similarly, what about prostaglandin I2? It prevents platelet aggregation and increases vasodilation. Another compound is there, which is thromboxane A2. This promotes platelet aggregation. So each prostaglandin has its own function, and each of them gets released depending on the situation and the injury that the body has gone through. Now, what about leukotrienes? These are the different types of important types of leukotrienes. You have leukotriene B4, which attracts neutrophils to the site of inflammations. So if the arachidonic acid goes to the LOX pathway, leukotrienes gets produced, and if it LTB4 gets produced, this is the one that attracts neutrophils to the site of inflammation, so the neutrophil can fight the bacteria. Now, what about leukotriene C4, D4 and E4? These are all involved in asthmatic and allergic reactions. So remember what happens in asthma. There is bronchoconstriction, right? So in asthma, this leukotriene pathway is activated through the arachidonic acid and then LOX pathway, and as a result of these chemical mediators, there is bronchoconstrictions. And finally, lipoxins are also produced through the leukotriene pathway, which inhibits the immune cells. Okay. Now, how do these things apply clinically in a pharmaceutical way? So, as you all would have heard about painkillers, right? NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So, these non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs acts on these COX pathways. They inhibit certain steps in the pathway, so they prevent the inflammation, the swelling, the pain, and all those things. Okay, some examples of your NSAIDs are your ibuprofen, aspirin, and celecoxib. Similarly, there are leukotriene receptor antagonists. So why do we use montelukast? If you can remember, we use montelukast for allergic reactions. So when you give montelukast, it's a leukotriene receptor antagonist. It doesn't let this leukotriene bind to the receptor and cause bronchoconstriction. Hence, there is no allergic reactions or the clinical manifestations that you see in an allergic reaction. Okay, so that's how it's related. Now I'll show you another flow chart that will give you a big, easier picture about all these things. So take a look at this. Arachidonic acid pathway, there's tissue injury to the phospholipid cell membrane, phospholipase A2, it causes the release of arachidonic acid. It either goes through cyclooxygenase pathway or the lipoxygenase pathway, COX1, COX2, produces the prostaglandins and your leukotrienes, which causes pain, inflammation, thromboxane causes platelet aggregation, and then you have your leukotrienes that cause bronchoconstriction and helps in supports asthma and smooth muscle contraction. Okay, so this is what happens in the tissue injury, and that's the importance of this pathway. Now, so what does NSAIDs do? NSAIDs, they go and they inhibit this. Leukotriene receptor antagonists inhibit this. So if this is inhibited, there is no pain, no inflammation. Okay, that's why NSAIDs are called your painkillers. Okay, because they stop inflammation, as a result they stop all the consequences that happen because of tissue injury. Okay, now there are certain specific types of NSAIDs. There are non-selective NSAIDs and selective inhibitors, COX2 selective inhibitors. So non-selective NSAIDs are those that affects COX1 and COX2 both. These are non-selective. Remember, COX1 is homeostatic. It is active during all physiological conditions, whereas COX2 is pro-inflammatory. It's majorly activated during injury or inflammation, pro-inflammatory, right? So non-selective NSAIDs inhibits both COX1 and COX2. These are the examples for it: ibuprofen, your diclofenac, and even your aspirin. Okay, so remember, patients with risk of heart diseases, they take a prophylactic dose of aspirin. Why do they do that? Because if you give aspirin is going to come and inhibit this pathway right here, right? So if it inhibits this pathway right here, it inhibits the production of thromboxane, which causes platelet aggregation. Now if there is platelet aggregation, there is a chance of forming emboli, right? And if there is emboli, there is a chance of heart diseases. There is thromboembolic stroke and all those things. So that's why people the old people who are in the risk of developing strokes or blocks, they take aspirin as a prophylactic precautionary dose. So it inhibits this pathway, and as a result thromboxane is reduced and platelet aggregation is reduced. Okay, that's how it's clinically applied. So those are examples of non-selective NSAIDs. But there are certain selective NSAIDs that act only on COX2 enzyme. Those are your celecoxib, rofecoxib, and all these examples. These drugs are especially for your COX2 and during inflammatory conditions. okay, they have higher selectivity towards COX-2 compared to the non-selective NSAIDs, which act both on COX-1 and COX-2. Now, I decided to make this video because this pathway is really important, and the pathophysiology, the pharmacology behind this pathway is kept on being asked from first year, second year, third year, from biochem, pharma, and till internal medicine and pedia in third year. And this is a very clinically applicable concept that everyone needs to know. And this is like one of the best examples that shows how first year biochem, second year pharma, and third year your diseases, your management and treatment part is all interrelated, and why it's important to integrate and study what we're studying. Okay, so I hope the concepts were really clear. Thank you so much.